So we're in your American history book and we're in chapter 10, the nationalist era. Another name for this nationalist era was the era of good feelings. Well, why do you think it was called the era of good feelings? Well, because the nation had come together. The War of 1812 was over, and they had become very patriotic during this time because they united them together in a common cause against the British invasion, right? So the War of 1812 renewed and reinstated the nation's feelings and character as the American Revolution had done, brought us back to our founding time, and united us together. The disappearance of the party strife as to follow the benefit nation as a whole held the United States together. That means they didn't have the party strife, the different parties fighting against each other. At this time, they were all in one accord. The era of good feelings was a time of, we'll find, James Monroe. And James Monroe was the last founding father to serve as president. He actually, we'll find James Monroe, he fought under George Washington, in fact. And he was there at the Constitutional Convention. So he was very popular and a student of Thomas Jefferson. So we find also that the Federalist Party, which we went over with Alexander Hamilton and George Washington at this time, had actually decreased. And so now they had a Federalist actually went forward for Monroe. And so they ended up coming together and thinking in more of the same way. So, and then we'll talk about the foreign policy and the foreign policy under another president-to-be who was Secretary of State. And we'll be talking about John Quincy Adams and onto the Monroe Doctrine at this time. So the nationalist era, bringing the nation together. Nationalist means everyone coming together as a nation. And the era of good feelings. The Second National Bank. Well, the first bank would expire because they had a 20-year charter in 1811. So during 1812, the bank didn't have a charter. So they had to go forth to put forth a new charter for the Second National Bank. During this time before the Second National Bank, private banks spread up in all the states. And so each state had their different banks. And each state issued their own paper money, which would be a problem because sometimes they would print more money than they could back with gold or silver, which meant that they would have a decrease in the value of money. The money wouldn't be worth much at all, and this is called inflation. In fact, some of the money in some states were practically worthless at this time, so there was definitely a need for a federal national bank and basically as to regulate all that the states were doing, right? So in 1816, the Republican Democrat Congress issued a 20-year charter for the Second National Bank. Henry Clay from Kentucky, he opposed the first bank. And actually, the first bank was actually opposed by even Thomas Jefferson. But now, seeing what it led to, they needed to be some regulation, they knew. So they were now willing to sacrifice the pride of consistency rather than jeopardize the nation as a whole. So the Second National Bank became for the next 20-year charter, the federal bank. Now there's a lot of issues, pro and con about that, especially who all is going to be controlling the federal bank. And we'll find that later on as we go through this chapter. The growth in manufacturing. So there had to be protection for America's manufacturing. So in 1812, we know we had the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act, and these cut goods from England England had been bringing very cheap goods, I should say, into the country. And so during this time when England was cut off, America had to start producing its own goods, such things as wool, leather, iron, textiles, paper, hats, gunpowder, glass, you name it. So American manufacturing was flourishing. The Republicans favored agriculture, though, in the South. But now they decided they needed to favor manufacturing, too. As President Jefferson, when he was president, said in the beginning, "Let our workshops remain in Europe," saying, we'll bring in our factory goods from Europe. Let the factories be in Europe. But at this time, as time changed, he changed his mind into manufacturing is now necessary to our independence and our comfort. He realized how important it was that Americans would manufacture their own goods so they wouldn't be controlled by another country, especially England. So, made in the USA, I put there. So the tariff of 1816. So after the War of 1812, the British merchandise flooded America. So, now they didn't have a tariff, so basically the merchandise that they had saved up, and they said, we're going to sell it in America very cheap. And this drove American made prices down, and some Americans went out of business because England was bringing in cheaper goods. So the manufacturers then turned to government help as they were losing their employees and people were becoming unemployed and such. They knew that they needed to get help. So President Madison, we're going on to President Madison. He was before Monroe, so we really haven't got to Monroe yet. But Madison, at the end of his presidency, he put forth a protective tariff and higher duties on English goods. And most Americans were really happy to have this tariff at this time. They needed America to manufacture its own goods. Even John Calhoun, and later on we'll see John Calhoun of South Carolina, would be totally against the rising tariffs. But at this time, he would basically say it is a duty of this country as a means of defense to encourage domestic industry. So even John Calhoun, like I said, later on being an enemy, at this time defended the tariff of 1816. So we'll see later on. This here is the tariff of 1816 that goes on to describe the tariffs going up and how then John Calhoun of South Carolina would call it a tariff abominations. You see, the Southerners, they needed to export their goods, mainly cotton, right? And they also were importing slaves too. So the Southerns believed that the tariffs would cause them to go out of business. So we would have a division between the North and South in this era of tariffs. So here's this guy's question. What about this tariff of 1816? The era of good feelings in 1816, Republican James Monroe, and he lived 1758 to 1813. He easily won the election over Rufus King. He was the last Federalist candidate. Many Federalists supported the Republican Jefferson now, as they had changed to many Federalist policies for national unity. So Jefferson actually, he endorsed a lot of the things that Alexander Hamilton had before. And so now the Federalists and the Republican Democrats were coming together. So President Monroe echoed the nationalist era of 1817 as the nation was coming together in this era of good feelings. Local jealousies yielded to generous, enlarged national policies. So as he toured America, Monroe toured America, and people cheered for him every place he went. In 1820, his second term, Monroe won all but one electoral votes. Can you imagine that? He won the popular votes and the electoral votes, and it definitely was an era of good feelings. And he represented that revolutionary spirit of the Declaration of Independence. But later on, differences in the North and South, industry versus agriculture, would begin to threaten future unity. We'll be talking about that later. Let's talk a little bit about President James Monroe, the fifth president. So he was born in 1758 in Virginia, Westmoreland, Virginia, to a farmer and a carpenter. And he also fought under George Washington, and he was wounded in the Battle of Trenton. He also was with George Washington in Valley Forge at the darkest time during our battle for independence. We would definitely consider Valley Forge. Well, Monroe was with Washington. So he also moved right next door to Monticello, Jefferson's home. In fact, you have to say Jefferson actually became good friends with Monroe. And actually, he was a devout follower of Jefferson and Madison during this time, except for certain policies that they did toward the end of their presidential time. So he was the last of the founding fathers as president. He died on July 4th, 1831. So when you talk about when he died, I have to say something else. Both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the second president, so the second and third president, died on July 4th too, 5 years earlier. And now we have James Monroe dying on the 4th of July, our Independence Day. That is pretty significant, don't you think? So he also dressed in his old-fashioned attire. So when he traveled, everyone says, man, he's kind of dressed back in the time of the Revolution, you know? And he did. Now, I don't know if this was purpose or he just liked the way he dressed when he was young. And so people kind of looked at him as old-fashioned in that way. His wife, Elizabeth Courtright, and 2 daughters traveled with him when he was through Secretary of State and when he traveled in Europe. He had a very sweet relationship with his wife and his girls. And so he took them and made sure that they were with him, and he loved them dearly. He was I would say he had a very Christian attitude. As we go on, I definitely believe all the presidents up to this time, I believe, had a foundation in Christianity. If not, they were born again Christians. But anyway, a significant role in the purchase of Louisiana, because when you think of the Louisiana Purchase, we always think of who? We think of Thomas Jefferson. Well, Thomas Jefferson was president, but at that time, Robert Livingston had been, as for that, minister to France at that time, and he sent Monroe to see what was going on. So Monroe arrived, and that's when Napoleon, they were going to make a deal with Napoleon and to buy New Orleans, and for so much money, and because they knew we needed that port. But instead, Napoleon, he wanted the money. So he thought, well, this is a good opportunity, you know. I'm just going to sell that wilderness. We don't need that wilderness. And so basically Napoleon made a deal to sell the whole Louisiana Purchase, huge portion of land to James Monroe, who made the deal. We didn't have text messages or email, or even the post office couldn't get to our phones. So James Monroe had to make that decision even without Thomas Jefferson. But as he did, Jefferson for sure was excited about this purchase of land. Anyway, we went over that before. But as for Monroe, he also served the country for over 50 years, and he held more public offices than any other president in the history so far. One pretty unique thing about Monroe was he was anti-slavery. In fact, along with Madison and with Jefferson, they decided that they would found a a country in Africa where that they could send back freed slaves, or send back their slaves to Africa that were coming over. So they were thinking when the slaves came, when they brought the slaves in, they could actually bring these slaves back to a safe place in Africa. In fact, Monrovia, Liberia is named for President Monroe as he put this together. Now, a lot of African slaves did not go back there, but we did have a lot of missionaries that did and brought the gospel to Liberia in Africa. So, other things, let's see here. He attended William and Mary College. He fought in the Revolution, as I said before, ministered to Great Britain and to France. And he was a senator from Virginia, of course, and a two-time governor of Virginia, Secretary of War, and two-time Secretary of State. So I said he served the government for a long time, or served our country for a long time. The Panic of 1819 happened, though, during this time, and it led to a depression of 1821. Why do you think? Well, I would think it had something to do with our banking situation. But there was an economic crisis, and this put the United States later on into this depression time. Poor management of the bank in the United States in those early, I'm not saying early years, but in the early years of the Second National Bank. And the Treaty of Ghent of 1814, which ended the War of 1812. The frontiersmen, after the treaty there, they saw that they could rush in and obtain land very, very reasonably, if not free in some areas. So the frontiersmen were rushing in to obtain land in the West. And this encouraged what's called speculations. They would buy this land or acquire this land so that they could sell it as a profit when the market raises. So many bought land, and that they could not afford the land after a while, and by borrowing money from these wildcat banks that were not national banks, they were the state banks, they would loan them this money very cheaply, sometimes without very low interest, without interest almost, and this would be very reckless in loaning this money for big profits. So basically they were speculating land. And the United States tried making loans more difficult at that point, realizing these loans were causing a big problem in America with inflation and such. And suddenly no one could afford to borrow land at all, So they went from easy borrowing money to not borrowing money at all. And then a panic broke out. With speculators, some of the banks shut their doors as they were losing their money, and some of the speculators would lose their money. They had bought this land, now the land was not worth anything, and they couldn't sell the land, and the prices of goods fell into depression. Now this is common. This is actually common what happened at different times as they go into a panic, into depression. It has a lot to do with the bank at this time. And of course we had foreigners kind of controlling our bank in America too. So manipulating things. Also during this time, we have John Marshall of the Supreme Court. And we have some cases. John Marshall definitely was of the old school of the Federalists, as under basically the founding fathers of George Washington onto, clear to Thomas Jefferson, and now even to Monroe. So he was a Supreme Court justice. So the McCulloch versus Maryland and the National Bank. So let's talk about this. There are some things that were very important, some decisions that were very important that were met by John Marshall at this time. So the constitutionality of the National Bank. The panic was blamed, of course, on the National Bank. And so in Maryland, the tax transactions of Baltimore branch. So Maryland comes in, and the cashier of the Maryland Bank refuses to pay taxes at all, or saying we're not going to uphold anything to do with the nation, with paying taxes from our bank. And so the state suit upheld the Maryland law, and then they appealed to the Supreme Court. Because we have now a bank in Maryland saying, okay, we're the national bank of our own. We're our state bank. We're not going to go by whatever they say to do. And so they had to appeal this to the Supreme Court, because this really made the national bank of non-accord if Maryland was saying they weren't going to go by any of the rules and bylaws of it. And so McCulloch versus Maryland is one of the most important decisions in America, because it set forth that the national bank was in the Constitution. Before they thought, oh, does the Constitution even talk about the bank? It doesn't necessarily, but it talks about the powers of the bank. The national bank was necessary and proper to levy taxes, collect taxes, and borrow money. Well, how could you do that if you didn't have a national bank? We wouldn't be able to levy taxes or collect taxes or borrow money. They basically saying there's implied powers there. And this, according, was a loose interpretation of the Constitution within John Marshall and his belief, looking, yes, the national bank is of the Constitution of America. And this would also increase the power of the federal government, which a lot of people were against, that the government becoming that powerful. And so this court did rule at this point, the Supreme Court ruled the constitutionality of the United States of America's bank. And so the state of America could not tax any agencies of the national government, and they actually had have to pay their taxes such to the nation's bank. So this was very important, because what would happen then, all the other states would say, oh, we're not going to do anything that they say about this national bank. And so John Marshall, of course, supported federal supremacy at that time, which was much needed, really. Otherwise, we couldn't hold together as a nation. And he supported economic development, as you can see in some of these saying, and he supported judicial power, saying that we need to have a Supreme Court that has power. If we don't, then what do we have a Supreme Court for? Is what his beliefs were in that. But just remember, McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch, that was the cashier secretary of this thing. But anyway, they ended up saying, is the national bank Constitution? Oh, is it in the Constitution? And he said, yes, it is. Other important decisions at this time by the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall were the Dartmouth College versus Woodward in 1819. Well, what was this about? A college. Well, the state of New Hampshire basically decided that they wanted to change the charter of Dartmouth College and take it from being a private college to being a public one. They said, we're just going to take this college and we're going to make it into a public college now. Well, the charter was binding, they said, and the charter said that they cannot tamper with this charter, and they had to remain a private college at this point. And so they had this discrepancy, and they went to court, to the Supreme Court, and basically John Marshall said, yes, the charter is a binding contract. These contracts are binding, not to be tampered with in Dartmouth, unless Dartmouth totally changes its foundation. It will be a private school, private college. So that was kind of important, how now colleges couldn't just change whenever they wanted without developing a new charter. The next was the Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. And this, the Supreme Court defined what interstate commerce was. Well, this is pretty important, because you had these tycoons that became very rich and had a monopoly on transportation from New York to New Jersey. They would say, they enforced taking these, what would I say, ferries and such to get across over to New Jersey. You had to take this, and they would charge whatever price they'd like to charge from these New Yorkers and going into New Jersey. And so we had several businessmen with controlling powers. One of them were the Vanderbilts, in fact. So they were charging these to go across the river. Well, they were going into New Jersey, into a new state. So Gibbons versus Ogden had to do with this transportation. And John Marshall ruled that it was interstate commerce. That basically they were going, since they're going between states, then it was clearly given that to the federal government in the Constitution to regulate interstate commerce, so that through the Constitution, the government would be in charge of this and not these huge monopolies on tycoons making a lot of money charging to go from New York to New Jersey. And now interstate commerce. Interstate commerce now would be controlled by this decision between states to be run by the government and not by the states of either New Jersey nor New York, or between any states, because the states would fight on what they had between the states at that time. So this is Gibbons versus Ogden. You can see the arguments. Dartmouth College. So these were all important decisions during this time. John Marshall, he's very, very important in our founding fathers, and he spent 34 years on the Supreme Court. Marshall had significant effects on American history. In fact, without John Marshall, we would probably not even be a nation right now, as he held the nation together using the Constitution and the constitutionality in certain areas. He took every opportunity to broaden the power of the national government at this time, which needed to be. Otherwise, we would be divided into a whole bunch of little countries instead of states. And he gave the Supreme Court of America the important position in our government that we have today. So now, with him, the Supreme Court became a check and balances on the other courts of the Congress and on the executive department, concluding the president and the vice president. So now we have an important Supreme Court. That's John Marshall. So we're going to stop there and go on to the next part, going through chapter 10, and we're going to see how it goes from Monroe onto John Quincy Adams. I really like John Quincy Adams, although he was not popular as a president, but as a Secretary of State, he did some magnificent things.